We are really delighted to have Anant here, and I'm extremely proud that he's there here to address the folks about the Indian economy. I really feel that this is one of the subject a lot of the professionals should take it up and understand the depthness of that particular subject. And today we have Anant who would be taking care of the entire. And I know a lot of the people will ask him the questions for the sectors which would see the turnaround, the job opportunities, the this, that. So I think Anant, you will be having a hell lot of questions at your end today. And about Anant, I think I'll give it up to Ujjwal, who'd kind of give a brief about Anant today. And I hope that this 1.5 hour would be a complete transformation for students. Today's Guru Purnima. I think this is a gift from Anant to all of us, where he would be sharing his precious knowledge. Thank you so much, Anant, for providing this opportunity. Glad to be here.
Thank you, sir. Good morning to everyone. I would like to extend a warm welcome to our speaker, Mr. Anant Narayan at first, and thank each and every one of you for being here with us today for this webinar on Indian economy, a way ahead. Mr. Anant is an associate professor at SP Jain, and he is currently an additional director nominated by RBI on the board of Yes Bank, and an independent director on boards of SBI Capital Markets, Clear Crop Dealing Systems, and CARE Ratings. He is a member of SEBI Mutual Fund Advisory Committee, FICCI's Capital Markets Committee, and Kerala Infrastructure Fund Management Investment Committee. Mr. Anant has over 24 years of experience in banking and financial markets with Standard Chartered Bank, Deutsche Bank, and Citibank. Till December 2017, he was MD and Regional Head of Financial Markets, ASEAN and South Asia with Standard Chartered Bank. He was Vice Chairman on the Board of Fixed Income, Money Market and Dealers Association and Foreign Exchange Dealers Association of India between 2012 and 2017. Prior to that, he was with Citibank in Mumbai till 2005 as Director and Head of FICC Trading, and with Deutsche Bank in Mumbai as Managing Director and Head of Global Rates for South Asia till August 2009. He was on the board of Central Depository Services Limited and Standard Chartered Securities India Limited between 2013 and 17. Mr. Anant has been part of various SBI committees, including FX options, interest rate futures, financial stability, financial benchmarking, and etc. He appears in print and television media for views on macroeconomics and financial markets. He is passionate about diversity, learning, ethics and integrity, people, and collaboration. Thank you, sir, for taking out time for this webinar from your busy schedule. And I would now request you to take over this webinar.
Thank you very much, Ujjwal, and thank you as well, Shripal. We appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you. I presume a lot of you and most of you would be students. So happy Guru Purnima as well to everybody. And once again, thank you to Simandar Education for this fantastic opportunity. Shripal and Ujjwal both said a lot of nice things. About 50% of them is true, so it's fine. The good thing of being a professor is I can sit in my comfortable chair in a comfortable room, despite all of the rains and monsoons which are going on outside, and give a lot of gyan about all the problems in the world and what needs to be done going forward, etc. Mine is an easy job, so I have to start off with the preface that it's easier to comment about the economy and what's happening rather than actually addressing it. So while I will offer a lot of criticism, a lot of critique about what's happening around us, I have to acknowledge that some of these are really, really tough problems, and you have to be cognizant of the fact that in times like this, it's easier to critique rather than actually do. So what am I going to do today? Professors love to talk, so I'm going to speak. What I will speak about is the following. One is I'll spend some time about the state of the Indian economy before COVID-19. Why is that important? I think COVID-19 is obviously a huge shock, one of the biggest shocks that we've gone through in our lifetime. Once COVID-19 is over, and I hope and pray that gets over fast, we will come back to the issues which dogged us even before COVID-19. So it's important we don't lose sight of what we were like before COVID-19, and I will spend some time there. Second, I will look at COVID-19 and my own perspective of how India will emerge out of COVID-19. This will be a lot of opinion because, frankly, this is a sketchy area where very little information is available. We have to use guesstimates and in some cases, absolute guesses. But nevertheless, I'll offer you my 2 bits on what will happen to India through the COVID-19 crisis. Finally, post-COVID-19 situation, and there I'll try and break it up into 2 parts. One is the short-term response of what is already happening, what more could be done, And then finally, the more medium term, what is it that India needs to do? Where I will come back to the issues which were there before COVID-19 and try and relate to that. So let me start right away with the situation for the Indian economy before COVID-19 hit us, with completely out of syllabus. India's economy was not in good shape even before COVID-19. Now, the best way of gauging that is to look at some indicators, to look at something like a health report of the Indian economy. The biggest health report, in my view, is the state of the financial services ecosystem. By that, I mean banks, non-banks, housing finance companies, microfinance institutions, and so on and so forth. They were in a pretty soft shape for a few years now. In fact, you could argue for the last 1 decade, they've been progressively sort of becoming weaker in some sense or the other, requiring a lot of help along the way. In what sense do the indicators show they were not in the best of health? The biggest indicator is the level of the non-performing assets. Now, here is one problem which dogs us throughout the description of the Indian economy. Not all data is complete. Some of the data is half data, and some of the data is simply not available. And we will revisit this theme as we go along. But here is a situation in respect of non-performing assets for the Indian financial services ecosystem. For banks, as of September 2019, the official non-performing assets was at 9.3% of advances. This is the gross non-performing assets. Okay, that number will change as of March, will change obviously after COVID-19 and so on and so forth. And that number has gone up over the years. It was something like 4.6% of GDP of advances, if I remember, as of 2015 March, and then came up to about 11.6% as of March 2018. Not because the economy did badly, but because the banks were forced to recognize the true nature of their non-performing assets. So earlier you had a lot of restructuring. You had, you could pretend that the loans were okay even though they were not, and that was progressively taken away by the RBI since 2013 onwards, culminating in something called an asset quality review, which forced banks to come out and say, this is what my non-performing assets look like really. And that's why the numbers went up dramatically to about 11.6% of advances as of March 2018. It's come down subsequently. September, as I mentioned, September 2019 was 9.3% of advances. But here is the problem. It's not the full number. Even now, even before COVID-19, there were certain forbearances being given by the RBI. What does that mean? In respect of certain MSME loans, the banks were allowed to pretend that the loans are performing even if they're not. Likewise, in respect of certain category of real estate loans, the banks were allowed to restructure without taking into account the fact that the loans may no longer be performing. So about 7 to 8 lakh crores worth of loans, some portion of that was not being classified appropriately as non-performing loans. Now, what would be the real number? Very difficult to say. These are guesstimates. But a lot of good people, including Credit Suisse, including a whole bunch of other analysts, have gone through these numbers. In my own estimate, anything between 11 to 12% is the true actual non-performing, gross non-performing assets of Indian banks, adjusting for these issues around real estate, non-bank finance companies, and particularly MSMEs and the Mudra loans. So it's not a big difference. 9.3 to 11 to 12% is not the end of the world. So, but it's still a big difference. It's still absolute terms, it's a big number. More importantly, for non-bank finance companies, there a proper asset quality review has not gone through. So the official number for non-performing assets of non-bank finance companies was 6.3% of advances as of September 2019. That number is not believable. It's very unlikely that non-bank finance companies have a lower NPA as compared to banks, because they do lend to sectors which are a little more trickier, including builders, including lending against shares, including acquisition financing and loans against property and so on and so forth. So given the nature of the lending, it's reasonable to assume that it would be at least as much as of banks, if not worse. So overall, therefore, the non-performing assets was already at 11 to 12% of advances, give or take. And that's a big number, And one of the reasons why lending has been coming down so dramatically, in fact, for the year ended fiscal year 2020, the actual lending by banks, non-bank finance companies, everybody put together, probably grew only about 4 to 4.5% for the full year, and one of the lowest numbers of credit growth that we've seen. Lots of reasons behind it, but one of the reasons is the fact that there is this overhang of non-performing assets, and therefore there is less credit appetite, there is less risk appetite, and there's a lot of trust deficit around the whole ecosystem. So that is one big indicator that things really weren't good about the Indian economy as a whole put together. Now, and I talked about trust. Something like a financial services ecosystem relies entirely on trust. If you don't have trust, you can't bank, you can't do financial transactions. So it is a bit of a problem. Now, related to this big chunk of problem on the financial sector is a whole bunch of other sectors which were already in chronic stresses. Sectors such as real estate, sectors such as power, sectors such as telecom, sectors such as airline and shipping, many industrial sectors relating to micro, small and medium enterprises. Many of them were already chronically stressed. And I don't want to go into each of the sectors, but you can give examples around power, for instance. Many power plants actually are producing power at pretty high tariffs. They're simply not viable if you were to do a proper market, study at this point in time. Many distribution companies, which are largely state-run, state government-run, simply don't collect enough money from you and me to pay for the power producers, which means every year there is about 20% of leakages on account of theft, on account of other leakages, which actually the DISCOMs or the distribution companies actually borrow in the market just to pay the power producers. So the amount of debt that these distribution companies are actually piling up year on year merely to pay the power producers is just rocketing up every year. So it's simply not viable. Something has to give at some point in time. Likewise with real estate, a lot of real estate loans are considered to be current and standard on the books, particularly of non-bank finance companies and housing finance companies, where most experts will tell you those loans are simply not viable. The builders or the entities behind those loans simply don't have the means to pay back the money. So there are plenty of sectoral issues which are dogging the ecosystem. Third, I think the most important problem that India has been facing, and not just for the last 5-6 years, it's been there for the last 10, 15, 20 years, and lots of economists have written about this, is the biggest strength that India is supposed to have is her demographics. The fact that we have a very young population, exemplified, I'm sure, by the people on this chat. And therefore, it's an aspirational, very high quality, very talented bunch of people who can do a lot of amazing things. And witness what Indians are doing across the world. Look at Silicon Valley, for instance. So it's a very aspirational population which is capable of a lot of things. Yet, some of the demographic indicators tell us that we are missing the bus in reaping this demographic dividend. Few statistics which you guys and girls are, I'm sure, very well aware of. Statistics indicate that about 44% of India's population is engaged in agriculture directly, which produces about 15% of India's GDP, 14 to 15% of India's GDP, probably will be higher this year. That's a terrible statistic. It just tells you that, there are too many people in farming and agriculture. It's not because people love agriculture and farming. It's merely because there are not enough jobs outside of agriculture, and therefore they are not being gainfully employed. I mean, people talk about the need to do agricultural reforms and make it more productive. I think it's putting the cart before the horse. The first thing required is you need jobs which can draw people out of agriculture. Once you have those jobs in manufacturing or services or other areas, then you can think about making agriculture a lot more productive. So that's a big indicator. Lots of other indicators. For instance, only about 17% of India's GDP, as measured by the NSO, etc., is actually produced by women. Now, this is not about argument about how do you measure GDP, etc. It just tells you that a lot of our women folk are simply not going out to the workplace, and therefore 50% of the population is completely being underutilized in productive activities. Why is it important? This 17% number, by the way, comparative numbers for the world is about 40%. Even for emerging markets is about 34%. 17% is a shocking statistic. I think it's comparable to the Middle East kind of situation. It's that bad. Now, Why is this important? Countries which have done extremely well on exports, Vietnam, Bangladesh, etc., actually a lot of their workforce centers around women. The ready-made garment industry, for instance, is almost entirely centered around women. So there is a big chunk of our population that is simply not utilizing well enough. Likewise, there are plenty of other indicators. The PLFS, Periodic Labor Force Survey for 2017-18, and now we have 18-19 as well, tells us that rural unemployment amongst the youth is very, very high. Okay, it's 18 to 20% across men and women, which is a terrible statistic again. Likewise, the labor participation rate, which is how much of our population is actually working, that number is 35, 36%. It ought to be much more closer to 50%. And just this way, much of our workforce is simply not working, or much of our population is simply not working. So plenty of statistics telling us that we are not doing enough in terms of creating productive jobs. Another one is on trade deficit. The fact is, and you know this, I know this, much of the stuff you see behind me is probably not made in India. You buy plastics, you buy any kind of machinery, any kind of trinkets, electronics, this phone out here, this laptop that I'm using for speaking to you guys with, bulk of this stuff is produced outside, right? The fact is our trade deficit has been bludgeoning, and it's not just to do with energy and oil imports. It's to do with a whole host of other issues, electronics, as I mentioned, gold, as I mentioned, chemicals, pharmaceutical APIs, plastics, toys, whole bunch of things which frankly ought to be manufactured in India. We're importing from overseas. Even today, manufacturing is, the core manufacturing is barely 16-17% of our GDP, which is a huge shame. I mean, we've completely missed out on this manufacturing bus. We've come to the stage where we are saying, oh, it's too late now, nothing can happen, kya hoga iska. But, I think that's too defeatist. The reality is there are still opportunities, and this is one area we simply have to improve on. We cannot be importing everything from overseas. We have to create jobs for our own people, create quality stuff comparable to the quality in the rest of the world, and therefore give gainful employment to the people. We need employment. We need jobs and output eventually for solving all our problems. So this is a state of the economy, a weak financial services ecosystem, many other sectors which were already weak, real estate, power, telecom, airline and shipping, the list, MSMEs, the list goes on. Third, in terms of creating jobs and output, we had a very poor track record. Our demographics aren't looking good. We import too much of manufactured stuff. We are simply not creating enough jobs onshore within ourselves. Many people relate that to the fact that ease of investments in India is very, very low. So if you have to start a company and if you have to employ 200 people, 300 people to produce something, it's not easy. While our ease of doing business at World Bank statistics have improved, on the ground ease of doing investments to create jobs and output is still rated as very, very high. In fact, Manish Sabharwal gave that fantastic YouTube chat where he explained all the kind of constraints which come around into ease of doing investments. So that's been the background to our economy over the last few years. In fact, this thing has been building up for over a decade now. So it's not one political party, it's an entire ecosystem as a whole. Now, a couple of things. What has the government done in relation to all of this happening? It's not sat idle. There's a lot of criticism which people give to the government, saying that, you've been fiscally too prudent, which means you're not spending enough. You should do a lot more of spending. Don't let Western economists tell you that you can't spend more. Use the fiscal deficit, spend some money. Everybody's doing it anyway. Print some money, spend it, and therefore create demand. Actually, the government has been doing this. I mean, it's been very unfair to the government to say you've not been doing enough of this. How have they been doing this? They've been doing it because the official numbers on fiscal deficits, which is how much is the government spending compared to how much it collects, the actual numbers are far higher than what the official numbers show. So fiscal year 2019, for instance, which is the year ended March 2019, the official center plus state fiscal deficit, which is how much of net spending has these two governments, all these governments got done compared to their total receipts, was 5.9% of GDP. Okay, the actual number was probably 2% higher, at least 7.8, 7.9% of GDP. Okay, how are these numbers managed? How is it that they have managed to hide these numbers? There's a lot of off-balance sheet borrowing the government does, which means, I'll give you a simple example. the government has to pay Food Corporation of India food subsidy. What does Food Corporation of India do? It buys produce from the farmers at a minimum support price, which is high. It sells that produce to us at the PDS, the public distribution system, which is much low. So the difference is made up by the government in the form of food subsidies. So for that fiscal year 2000 FY19, if I remember correctly, the official or the budgeted food subsidy was 1.7 lakh crores or so. Okay, thereabouts, give or take. The actual payment made eventually, officially, was only about 80,000 crores. So the difference of 90,000 crores, it's not that the payment was not made. Food Corporation of India was asked to go and borrow in the market. So what happened? The government did not pay Food Corporation of India the food subsidy. Instead, Food Corporation borrowed in the market. That borrowing does not show up as fiscal deficit for the government, and the government follows cash accounting. So it's a very simple rule. It's not accrual accounting. If you don't make a payment, you do not recognize an expenditure. So because it did not make this 90,000 crore payment to Food Corporation of India, it said, I don't have an expenditure. In reality, Food Corporation of India has the hole in that balance sheet. It had to borrow that money to make up for the lack of food subsidy coming from the government. So lots of public sector entities have actually borrowed in the market. It's not just Food Corporation of India, in lieu of payments due from the government of India. Okay, and that big chunk of that difference is that 2% that I allude to. And these are official government numbers. In fact, the former finance secretary of the government has explained how this entire fudging happened. So that 5.9% actually was 7.8, 7.9% purely because of this. This does not include, by the way, the delays by the government to the private sector. So, anybody or many corporates that deal with the private sector also report that there are delays from payments from the government. And one reason is exactly this. If the government delays the payment, it shows a less expenditure in that particular year. So reality, therefore, is the actual spending being done by the government is far higher than what the official statistics show. By the way, FY20, while the full numbers for the states aren't out as yet, the actual center plus state fiscal deficit could be 9.6 or 9.7% of GDP, against 7.8% for FY19. So it's been going up. So the government is spending a lot. Where is that money coming from? Actually, our savings, which is what you and I save as a percentage of our GDP, has been coming down. Financial savings of the household sector has been coming down. It was about 6.4% of GDP as of the last year. So government is borrowing about 9.6% of GDP. Its actual savings is only 6.5%. So who makes up the difference? It actually is, a lot of it has come from the RBI. The RBI has been buying government bonds even before COVID-19. It bought about 3 lakh crores worth of bonds in the fiscal year between July 2018 and June 2019. It transferred a record surplus to the government, 1.76 lakh crores the last fiscal year. All of this, in a way, is the RBI effectively creating money so that the government can spend it. Okay. So there is this creation of money and spending, which is already underway from before, from COVID-19. And this is the backdrop to the entire economy. One theme I'll leave you with, and it's a very long prologue to what the economy was like before. What is India's national motto? It is Satyameva Jayate. It is truth alone shall prevail. A lot of the stuff I mentioned to you is we are not entirely open on the truth. So whether it is the true level of NPAs, whether it is the true level of fiscal deficit, whether it is a true status of what's happening on job creation, output creation, etc., there's a lot of degrees of uncertainty, which is unnecessary. Now, it's a controversial topic, and there are lots of objections to coming out with the full picture. So one objection is, can we handle the truth? What is the utility of this truth? Look at China, for instance. China comes up with completely nonsensical statistics. Nobody believes them, right? So why is it that truth is so important? Now, the way I see it personally, it's not truth for truth's sake. I mean, let's leave the moral question outside. If you are a medical patient, you need medical reports to be able to actually diagnose and do the cure. Okay. If your family member goes through a medical checkup and the medical checkup shows very high BP or very high sugar, and you say, you know what, let's be positive about this, let's bring down the numbers, or let's keep the thresholds very high, so let's say there is no problem. Why would you do that? Now, you would do that if you think this is a terminal case. कि मतलब, I'm sorry to be morbid, but if you think nothing can be done, क्या फायदा है फिर? मतलब, what is the point of panicking if nothing can be done? But things like sugar and BP are absolutely controllable. There is no problem in India that cannot be controlled, that cannot be cured. We are not a terminal patient by any yardstick. We are the one economy which has the brightest future given the quality of our people. We should remind ourselves that every day, every hour. Okay? To us, to suppress or to be cute about medical reports is being absolutely silly. There is no problem that's not curable. Of course, the cure will be tough, and we'll have to face some really tough questions. But to say that, can India handle the truth? Of course, we can handle the truth. You might think it's tough, but I think it's absolutely possible. And without right medical reports, how do you even go about with the urgency required to do the treatment? I think that's very, very critical. On China, look, China fudges. I mean, there's no questions asked. Of course, they fudge. But my 2 bits on comparing India with China. First of all, this kind of comparisons are useless. Every country is different. We cannot say because he's doing it or she's doing it, I will also do the same thing. If we can create the jobs and output that China has created, okay, if we can become the manufacturing capital or at least half the manufacturing capital of the world and create jobs and output, I think we can fudge whatever we want. Now, we cannot have the worst of both worlds, where we are not giving or not performing anywhere close to our potential, and we are being cute about recognizing the real problems. So to me, anyway, it's a contentious topic, but I often hear very senior people saying, "Oh, if we come out with the real NPA numbers, what will happen to the ecosystem? What will happen to the borrowing? What will happen to the economy? What will happen to that company? If we come out with real state of what's happening on the fisc, then what will the rating agencies say? What will happen to our bond markets, currency markets? Nothing will happen, because every single problem has a solution. Even if you don't want to make it public, at least recognize the problem and make sure we're doing everything required to address these problems. And I'll come to that in the last part. Okay, long harang opening statement. Now let me go to the COVID-19 itself and what's going to happen to us. So very quickly on the medical part. Look, I'm not an expert on COVID-19. I can't even pronounce that word, epidemiologist. I'm nowhere close to that. I don't understand this stuff. So we should always listen to the good doctors, to ICMR, to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, to all doctors, medical professions everywhere. So that's the broad first off takeaway. Few things, of course. One is that the number of cases is still going up. 20,000 plus in a day is obviously a worrisome number. We are still seeing lingering cases of semi-lockdowns, quasi-lockdowns. Don't go beyond 2 kilometers in Mumbai, cities like Chennai, and now reports about Bangalore, etc., etc. Lots of questions about have we really opening up? Can we really open up? And what are we doing, etc., etc. A few positives I take away from this. Again, not as an expert, but purely as a lay person. One is the number of cases obviously is going up. The reported cases is going up, but it's also on the back of an increased amount of testing. We are now testing something like 2.5 lakh cases per day, tests per day. Every expert that at least I speak to says that the road to recovery is starting with good testing. So we are on that right path. I think that's a great sign. Second thing is, if I look at, if I at least see the trends in places like Mumbai proper, or even in Delhi proper, or even in Chennai, which obviously was going through a lot of trouble, things seem to be settling down. One anecdotal experience or example, Dharavi we were very, very scared of, right? Dharavi is this, largest slum in Mumbai. That seems to be under control. So kudos to the people who are coming together, the officials across all government agencies, the doctors, and so on and so forth. It seems like that place is under control, which tells us that if we pay enough attention to a problem, we can solve it. It's not beyond our solution. Third thing is the medical response, the health response of creating beds, that the 10,000 beds being created in Delhi, etc. That they're very, very heartwarming, and they also indicate that people are working together. Local government, central government, state government, everybody seems to be working together, and of course a lot of NGOs, etc. So I think the response is coming together. While cases are going up, it's in new places. Hopefully they will subside soon as well. The older places where we had cases, hopefully they continue to taper down and we don't see relapses, etc. And the medical response seems to be improving. So while the numbers will probably look scary for a while and we'll keep worrying and we'll hear more and more cases of people close to us who are COVID-19 positive, etc., I'm hoping that things are actually heading the right way. I have no idea where the peak is going to be. I have no idea how long this can go on, but I'm still fingers crossed and hoping. Now, so much for the health part, and I do stay safe, all of you, in wild times like this. Let's come now to the economic impact of all of this. Now, first questions first, what will be the impact on India's GDP, right? So here is the straight away, the mathematical part, which is less difficult to do, which is that we know that India went through one of the most intense lockdowns across the world, okay? Of course, it was required. Of course, it was needed to make sure that we control things and we build up infrastructure, etc. But it comes at an economic cost. So in the first lockdown, which started from 25th of March, went on, I think, till about 20th of April, because it was 14th and then went up to 20th, almost the entire country shut down. Only sectors such as agriculture, public services, which includes your defense, your police, your government hospital, and so on and so forth, healthcare, and a few other sectors was unimpacted. So if you speak to most economists, they will tell you that by doing all the juggling around the Excel spreadsheets, about 35-36% of the economy was unimpacted. You could even argue some parts of the economy are doing better. Healthcare might be doing better. Even agriculture looks like heading for a very, very good year. So some parts of the economy might be doing better. But that's just 36% of the economy in the first few days. That number went up as the lockdown was slowly eased up. So between 20th of April to 3rd of May, there was an opening which happened. 3rd of May to 31st of May, and then eventually 3rd of June, there was another opening which happened. And now we are again going through various rounds of opening. Now, it's very difficult to estimate what part of the economy is functioning again, but there are various economists who have come up with various numbers. It feels like about 36% was operational till 20th of April. Maybe that number went up to 45% by 3rd of May. Maybe it went up to, right now, maybe it is closer to 75 to 80% of the economy. These are guesstimates based on individual sectors. There is no doubt that some sectors have been hit really hard. Things like hospitality, tourism, things like transport, travel, road travel, and so on and so forth. Anything to do with discretionary spending, lots of industries, even things like textiles, even things like any kind of, metals, non-metals, real estate, construction, etc. A lot of sectors have been hit and continue to see the pressures from all of that. So even if you were to assume that 75 to 80% of the economy is up and running right now, with some parts doing well, as I said, agriculture will probably have a very good year this year. And even if you assume that by August, which is a month from now, the economy will go to 100%. I don't know that will happen, but I'm saying let's be bullish, let's be positive and assume that happens. Even then, given the long kind of hiatus we've had, we could see a double-digit contraction in GDP. Okay. In fact, Dr. Pranab Sen has written this 5-part series in Ideas for India, which I would strongly encourage students to go through. He again talks about a double-digit 11% or so kind of contraction for this fiscal year. It's a number. Okay, so first of all, we shouldn't get shocked by it. We shouldn't say this is the end of the world. It's not. But it just gives you a sense about what is it that we are up against, and what is the what is it therefore that we have to do going forward. So that's on the headline GDP. It's a number. It's going to be like looking at the rear view mirror. Ki kya ho gaya hai. It's useful though to tell you what can lie ahead. There is significant, therefore, with this kind of a contraction, there is very, very significant humanitarian and business economic distress as well, right? So there is, we all saw the stories of migrant workers moving out, especially in the month of March and April. It looked like they were really tough times for them. Things have improved, I think, dramatically since then. But nevertheless, there was a lot of problems. Unemployment, as measured by CMIE, went to 28-30%, during parts of April, etc. Now again, it's come down dramatically. It's about 8% now as of end of June. So things have improved, and we'll come to that in a bit. But there was a significant amount of humanitarian distress, and therefore business distress as well. When I talked about all those sectors which are clearly facing trouble, including industry for that matter, remember that a bulk of, in terms of numbers, at least sheer numbers, a bulk of India's businesses are micro, small, and medium enterprises. 63 million MSME enterprises, accounting for a chunk of industry and services being provided in this country. They will be hit very badly as well. There's no doubt about it. Okay. Now, so that's the economic and the humanitarian / people workforce distress as well. That will have an impact on what I mentioned about the health of the financial services ecosystem. I mentioned that the real numbers for non-performing assets, gross non-performing assets, was probably already at 11-12% of advances. That number, unfortunately, could go up to 18 to 20% of advances, assuming that the numbers were allowed to come out, which means that you don't have forbearances, you don't say ignore the non-performing assets, etc. Okay. As a result, given that there is a sharp slowdown in the economy, which means your tax collections for the government are going to fall like a rock. Okay. Yes, GST collections for June looked a lot better, but that's, don't go by that. Overall numbers will come down dramatically. Clearly, incomes are down this year. So the fiscal deficit, which I said was about 9.6% center plus state put together for the last fiscal year FY20, could go up to as high as 14% of GDP for FY21. I expect more relief. A lot of relief has come through from the government already. So I expect more relief to come through, including all that. I think it goes up to 14% of GDP and beyond. Combination of lower tax collections, higher expenditures, and the fact that the denominator is lower because our GDP is not growing. It's in fact degrowing. So therefore the denominator is a lot smaller, and therefore your fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP will go up quite dramatically. 14% plus of combined fiscal deficit is an enormous number. RBI will have no choice but to monetize a bit of that. What does that mean? It will have to buy government bonds. It will have to transfer money to the government. It will have to do all sorts of conventional, unconventional things to provide the money for the government to spend, the central government to spend. And it will do it. I'm sure it will do it. And it's the right thing to do, I think, in my personal view. So the point being that COVID-19 is probably going to leave us with the biggest financial crisis that we've ever seen in our lifetimes. Okay, I don't want to overemphasize it. It's not exaggeration. It's looking like going to be a really, really tough time. Now, I promise you guys one thing. While all of this sounds very bleak, as I told you earlier in the first section, every single problem has a solution, and there is a way out for all of us to come out. And actually for India to achieve her immense economic potential. So keep that in mind every time I say something that sounds despondent. Okay, so just to summarize, a contraction in GDP of a double-digit contraction cannot be ruled out. There is significant distress amongst many economic sectors, and therefore on livelihoods and workforce, as well as on businesses. There is therefore significant stresses piling up on an already stressed financial services ecosystem, banks, non-banks, housing finance, MFIs, and so on and so forth. There will be no option but for the government to spend a lot more, which means the fiscal deficit numbers will go up, and the RBI will create money for the government to spend. There is no way out of that as well. Now, given all of this, how do we go forward from here, right? I'm going to break it up into two parts. One is what should we be doing right now? What is the short-term response that we have to do? And what is the long-term response that we should do? Again, I'm reminding all of you, I'm an armchair expert, so-called expert. Easy for me to speak, and I fully recognize that. But nevertheless, for whatever it's worth. Short-term impact. Look, I talked about deep financial distress. At this point in time, when there is so much of deep financial distress, we have no choice but to ensure that people have enough resources to manage their essential requirements, which means that you have to ensure that especially the bottom of the pyramid has food, they have money for essential purchases, and there isn't a complete humanitarian breakdown. Okay, that part I think is happening well. Okay, while there's a lot of criticism that the government should do more, ye hona chahiye, wo hona chahiye, which is all fair, but look at what actually has happened. Okay, one, the massive increase in NREGA. Okay, so the data for Mahatma Gandhi NREGA spending is out till June end. That shows about 37,000 crores has already been expensed. Okay, which is, and the total budget has been enhanced from something like 61,000 crores to about 1 lakh crores. So there's a big jump in the NREGA budget itself, and about 37-40% of that has been already spent, which means people have been given money. I mentioned to you earlier the CMI unemployment data showing a sharp reduction in unemployment. It's not because urban industries are back. It's not that at all. We know that. It's clearly because the NREGA schemes and other employments, rural employment schemes are taking effect. Now, one question which keeps coming up is the distress is in the urban centers, which is where COVID-19 is. So why are we giving relief to farmers and to the rural sector? I think it's smart, because the only people capable of spending right now is the rural sector. And plus, remember, a lot of migrant workers have gone back to the rural sector, rural areas, and they require things to happen. So if you want to pump up the economy, if you want to get spending in the economy, if you want to alleviate distress, that is the best route of doing it, to ensure that money is given to the rural folk. Okay, so NREGA is working out well. Along with NREGA, if you remember, in the first set of announcements which the government made, there was things like money to every account, pensions to women, pensions to Divyang, as they call it. So a lot of doles have gone out. A lot of them have gone out to the rural sector, which I think is excellent. Second, which is a huge positive, is the amount of food procurement by Food Corporation of India is at record levels. So actually the procurement season started slow. Normally the procurement season for the winter crop, for the Rabi crop, starts around April 1st. Because of the COVID-19 lockdown, it started only on 15th of April. But since then, they've actually increased the number of procurement centers by over 50%. And they've started procuring tons of wheat, of rice as well, and all sorts of food grains. So the level of food grains available right now as of June end in Food Corporation of India godowns is at record high levels. I don't know the exact number, 97 million metric tons or whatever it is. I forget the numbers, but it's there in the Food Corporation of India website. It's at record levels. Two things this does. One is it's put money in the hands of farmers. Remember, we had stories about farmers throwing their produce away because there was no logistics available to sell them. At least for food grains, the main food grains, that's not true. Farmers have been able to sell it to Food Corporation of India. They've got money in their hands, some amount of money. Second, because you have such record levels of food grains, you're now able to provide free food grains to a whole bunch of people, right? That 80 crore people that the Prime Minister spoke about, getting 5 kgs of rice or 5 kgs of wheat and 1 kg of pulses is entirely possible because Food Corporation of India has got that huge buffer stocks available. Now, by the way, it also comes with a fiscal cost. Remember, I talked about that food subsidy. Food subsidy bill is going to go up dramatically, and that is a fiscal cost which the government is bearing. Okay, so two things therefore. One is actually three things: procurement of food, and therefore giving money to farmers, doling out that food to everybody to ensure there is at least food security. People won't starve. Hopefully, the number of cases of people starving will be very, very minuscule. And that system seems to be working by and large. So therefore, use the food subsidy to actually give out and make sure there is food security till November, which is a good period of time, right? So at least till November, there's no problem at all. And third, NREGA, the fact that jobs are being created, such that in fact the numbers from CMI are quite heartening. I think if I remember correctly, for June end, the last week, the unemployment was about 8.5%. That's given that I think this was around 8% as of pre-lockdown. Okay, so it's almost down to pre-lockdown levels. Okay, so it's a dramatic improvement, at least in the overall employment. You might complain about the quality of employment, etc., but there's no other economic activity happening. What else do? You have to give money to people. So I think that part of trying to alleviate distress is happening well. Okay, and giving money to rural folk actually might be the smart thing to do at this point in time. I think it's happening pretty well. Okay. The second thing, which I already mentioned, I won't repeat, is the medical response is at least seems to be improving. Earlier, it sounded like a mess. You heard of cases in Mumbai, for instance, that the number of ICU or ventilators available is just not there. The health system is getting really stressed, and so on and so forth. I think a lot of that is being addressed. There is a response coming through. As I mentioned, the 10,000 bed hospital in Delhi, the cases in Dharavi being controlled, the number of beds slowly increasing, available, slowly increasing in all centers. There is good response happening out there as well. So that part is again a good response. Where I think there is still a gap, which has still not been addressed, is on the state of the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Okay, and it's a tough one. Now, a lot of people say, look at what the US did, look at what Canada did, look at what every other country is doing. They're putting money in the hands of businesses so that they can pay salaries, right? And we should do the same. Now, it's a tricky one. Okay, yes, the database has improved dramatically because of GST, because of formalization. There's a lot of better database available as to which business is doing what. But there are still gaps on the databases. And there's, of course, a question of how much money can we actually give out. That debate will continue. I'm personally hoping that the government will come out with its next set of relief directed specifically at MSME. Now, to be fair, it's given that 3 lakh crore helpline through banks, right? So it's given effectively a credit guarantee scheme where money can go to the MSME directly through banks, and therefore money is, at least there is a cash flow available for MSMEs. I'm not entirely convinced that provides enough relief to MSME. It's very good for banks and NBFCs, by the way, because it allows them to lend to their clients without taking on additional credit risk, which is great. But from an MSME perspective, look, your problem is your sales have come down dramatically. Your bottom line has really got hammered. You're still having fixed cost of salaries, of rent, and interest costs, and so on and so forth. Addressing this with greater amount of loans is not the best response, right? You're not looking for only cash flow. You're not looking for only money. You're also looking for help on the bottom line, right? It's a tricky one, and as I said, this is where my armchair status shows up. It's easy for me to say give something, but eventually, I think the next relief program hopefully will be directed directly at MSMEs, and some amount of money, maybe 1% of GDP, which is 2 lakh crores, maybe 2% of GDP, maybe 4 lakh crores, is actually given out to MSMEs in some form or shape. There will be leakages. Our databases are not perfect. There will be leakages. But perhaps this is not the time to worry about leakages, given the state of the economy. And by the way, the estimates are that up to 25% of MSMEs might be severely impacted by the COVID-19 situation. Can we really afford to see that many number of MSMEs collapse or go through severe stress? So given that the ramifications of not doing anything, it's not elegant, but I would still say that some amount of money has to go to MSMEs as well. Just as money has gone through NREGA, just as money has gone to farmers, and just as money has gone into healthcare, I think some money has to go to MSMEs as well. That's one probably area on the short-term responses, which I think is lacking. Medium to long-term responses. Now, nobody's talking about long-term responses, and it's fair. I mean, what the hell how do you do economic reforms when the economy is semi-shut? What does it even mean to say I will do labor reforms and land reforms, etc., when the economy is shut? So one school of thought is, at the moment, think a lot about the short term, don't worry about the long term. But here is where I disagree with that thought process. One is everything that I'm suggesting and everything that the government is doing in terms of giving relief to farmers, to rural employment, etc., is going to cost us on fiscal deficit. There is no magic money. We are going to essentially borrow from our future to invest or save the present. It's the right thing to do. We have to do it. But to be fair to the future, we also have to have a game plan about how is it that we are going to ensure that all the money that's being created now does not create problems subsequently. Now, to me, the one common goal that we should be going towards for ensuring that we manage to achieve our immense economic potential, as well as make sure that the cost of doing all that we're doing right now does not hurt us very severely in the future. There are a few bottom line things that we have to do. One is create sustainable jobs, create sustainable output, and create a healthy ecosystem which allows for the creation of jobs and output, which means things like education, things like healthcare, things like nutrition. I think these are the bottom line things that we have to focus the future on. If we have a game plan which says that here is how we are going to create sustainable jobs. Here is how we are going to bring down that number of people directly involved in agriculture from 44% to 25% over the next 10 years. Here is how our jobs in manufacturing are going to go up. Here is how the jobs in services are going to go up. If we have a game plan towards that, I can tell you the cost that we're incurring is nothing. Whether it is fiscal cost, whether it's the cost of redoing our financial ecosystem, whether the cost of cleaning up a power sector, real estate, everything we can pay for. If we have clarity about how is it that we're going to create sustainable jobs and output going forward, that's what is the bottom line. Now, how do we go about doing that? Let's start with some of the issues which I had mentioned to you earlier. By the way, one big chunk towards ensuring that jobs can be created on a sustainable basis is we need our financial services ecosystem to be healthy. So our banks, NBFCs, MFIs, etc. It's not enough if they survive. I mean, survival is easy; it will happen, not a problem. That's a silly, low objective to have, right? We need them to thrive. We need them to create money and create credit. People are often quote the statistic. India's total banking loan is about 100 lakh crores, 105 lakh crores, that's called 100 lakh crores. If you include NBFCs, it's about 125 lakh crores. If you include Housing Finance Corporation, etc., it goes about 240 lakh crores. So about 70% of our GDP is our total loans to the private sector from banks and NBFCs all put together. China's amount of credit to the private sector, forget about the government sector, private sector, which includes SOEs, to be honest, is more than twice that number. It's more than, it's almost close to 200% of GDP. Okay, total debt from China, in fact, including households and government, is like almost 3 times GDP. Debt is not a bad thing. In fact, debt is like the lubricant. It's like the liquidity which creates money and creates investment, creates jobs, and then it becomes a nice virtuous cycle where everything flows together. Essentially, the way in which you create jobs is you have to first borrow money, create infrastructure, create factories, create whatever you require for delivering services. That in turn employs jobs. It creates jobs, and therefore that creates consumption, which buys the stuff which the investments are producing. So you need this virtuous cycle of jobs and output, both domestic, to sustain a credit growth. That's the underlying point, but you need credit growth. Okay, you cannot have credit growth if the health of the banking system is the way it is, and therefore cleansing the banking system is super critical. Okay, and it has to start right now. Okay, it's not that you have to wait for post-COVID. If we know there are really large gross non-performing assets in the ecosystem which prevent the banks from doing their job, we have to find a way of addressing that issue. Okay, we have Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, IBC, and we have the NCLT processes. They are fantastic. IBC is a very good, reform, one of the best reforms on the financial sector that we've seen for a long, long time. But no bankruptcy system in the world is geared towards, tackling the kind of sizes that we have. Our sizes are just far too high, right? So we do need, or we might need, a one-time solution to actually addressing this overhang of NPAs that we have, particularly the pre-COVID ones. Forget about the ones which will come out through COVID-19, but the large pre-COVID ones, there has to be some way in which you quarantine them out, address them separately, and remove the burden of them on the banking system. Today, bankers are worried sick about NPAs, both the ones on their books and what can come going forward. They don't want to lend, because the last thing a public sector banker wants to do is to lend money. That number goes into an NPA as well, and then you have CBI, CVC, CAG all coming behind you and then stopping your retirement funds or whatever it is, and you go through hell for the rest of your life. Why would I want to lend? If I was a public sector banker, I wouldn't want to lend right now, right? So purely even from a private sector entity, an NBFC, for instance, a private sector NBFC, if the burden of the past NPAs can be removed, I start to think at least about going forward. What is it that I can do about fresh lending rather than only worrying about what the NPA situation is? Now, to me, the way to address the old NPAs is either by way of a bad bank or by way of something like a TARP, a Troubled Asset Reconstruction Program, like the US did. It's controversial. And I have equal number of people will tell you it's a good idea, equal number of people will tell you it's a terrible idea. The reason I like it is because I see no other choice. I mean, it's not elegant. Like this giving money to MSMEs, it's not elegant. Textbooks will tell you it's terrible. But I've personally seen cases like in the case of Malaysia, even in the case of Korea and other countries, where after the Asian crisis, creation of a sensibly designed bad bank, in the case of Malaysia, it was entirely government owned, can provide a lot of relief and can do the right things. In my view, if you transfer the bad assets at reasonable rates, which means at what are fairly judged to be recoverable rates, to, let's say, a government-owned bad bank, and you provide an upside to the selling institution, which means that if the recovery is higher than where the transfer is happening, money will go back to the original institution. So you create incentives for institutions to sell down the bad assets to a bad bank. If all of these are concentrated with the government, it's easier for them to resolve it. You might have to pass laws to change. Malaysia did that. Malaysia passed a lot of laws, changed laws in order to recover money from the bad assets. It becomes a lot more easier to do that and keep it outside of the banking system. Let the banking system do fresh or think about fresh businesses. So that's one part. The second part is, it's, the biggest criticism against bad banks is you're giving a free pass to people who have sinned in the past. You're a promoter, you've taken the system for a ride, you've taken money, and now you're getting a get out of jail free card because you know what? There's a bad bank which washes away all your sins. So you have to have reforms to ensure this cycle cannot repeat. That's one thing. Second, there has to be accountability, which means if you've sinned in the past, this is not a cleansing of your sins, any individual sins. This is a cleansing to ensure the system can go forward and do the right things for the economy. It's not something to wash away past sins. On ensuring that things do not revert back to the past, a lot of reforms are required in the financial sector. So for banks specifically, there's something called the PJ Nayak Committee recommendations. Specifically public sector banks, the underlying theme of that particular reform is get babus and netas out of banking. Okay, the NPAs that we are grappling with right now were created because telephone banking happened 10 years ago. Now you can say, oh, that was a exceptional situation. Now the government's intent is better, etc. But the moment you have governments and bureaucrats being able to control banking, the risk of that always remains. Why should you have bureaucrats and politicians who have plenty of other things to do actually worry about banking, which can be run by professionals? So you don't want telephone banking, you don't want schemes like Mudra forced upon banks, you don't want things like Shamiana banking. Get babus and netas out of banking, let them be professionally run. This is not a guarantee that frauds will not happen. Okay, that's a different issue. This is to give accountability and allow for professional management of banks and financial institutions. Governance is ownership neutral. Frauds happen in private banks, they happen in foreign banks, they happen in public sector banks. That has to be addressed separately. So governance reforms along with banking reforms, which is make credit rating agencies stronger, make boards stronger, make auditors stronger, make investments such as mutual funds, etc. Their ecosystem has to be stronger. So a lot of governance reforms are required. And lastly, market reforms are required. If we want market indicators to tell us what's the right price for a loan, you need secondary market liquidity in loans and in bonds. You don't have it today, right? So banking reforms, governance reforms, and market reforms have to go alongside anything you do as a one-time solution for non-performing assets. And doing all of this will hopefully give rise to an ecosystem over time. It will not happen overnight, but over time, an ecosystem which is capable of financing India's growth aspirations. And without a financial system which can fund our growth aspirations, we will not grow. And that's where you have to start with. Now, it's quite possible that people say this set of solutions is bunk up. It is terrible, it's a bad idea, and maybe they're right. Even if they don't follow this process, please remember status quo does not work. We've tried status quo of, pretend nothing is wrong, NPAs nahi hai, sab theek ho jayega, and look at what that has got us in the last 10 years. So even if you don't want to do this, come up with something else, but not status quo. Don't continue with where we are right now. Look for ways out so that banks can finance our growth all over again. That's the first big part. Second, please get truth into sectors such as real estate and power sector, etc. They are solvable problems. Yes, they will mean that a lot of people will get slapped. Okay, Builders might get slapped. NBFCs might get slapped. People like me who have invested in real estate might get slapped. Too bad. I mean, truth, unfortunately, will mean you have to take bitter medicine as well. Likewise, for the power sector, it might mean our tariffs eventually have to go up, that we cannot pay less for our power than what it costs to produce the power. But please recognize that there is no other way. Maybe if instead of us bearing the cost, the government bears the cost. That's fine. Let them take it as part of a fiscal deficit, but then take that in the fiscal deficit and show it there. So all the sectoral issues, whether it's power, real estate, telecom, airline and shipping, MSMEs, they require a huge amount of issues to be addressed at the base level. That a lot of these we don't have to wait for post-COVID. We can start doing the work right away, right? And the last part, the most important part, is creating jobs and output. And that's where, that's the bottom line, which means if you as an entrepreneur want to start a company and employ 100, 200, 300 people, you should think it's a breeze. You should not think about it and say, my God, I don't want to do this out here. Okay. We have such a huge opportunity of getting supply chains from China, even though globalization might no longer work, even though everybody is going towards localization. At least produce for ourselves, at least make for India, if not make in India, right? We need electronics, we need chemicals, we need plastics, we need toys, we need a whole bunch of things that we need to buy. All the raw materials for many of our industries come from outside. We need all those, we could make all those raw materials at home. Just getting those supply chains onshore and making sure we can produce these high quality will ensure our trade deficit comes down, and we create a lot of domestic jobs. So again, this ease of investments in India, improving that is a huge project by itself. It involves cleaning up our land laws and labor laws. It involves making our capital more efficient, and that's the financial sector reform part. It involves making our judicial processes much more easier to handle with. It involves making sure our policy framework is a lot more reliable. We don't have cases like, central government suddenly changing laws retrospectively to beat up one particular company like Vodafone as it did a few years back. So you have to have predictable policy, prescriptions and policy frameworks, etc. Overall, therefore, making it easier for people to set up manufacturing services or whatever, which creates jobs and output in India, if nothing else for India, has to be a huge focus area. The last bit, and I'll close with that, if anything this COVID-19 teaches us, it is the importance of taking care of our young people, right? The COVID-19 severely exposed how weak our health infrastructure is. Of course, we are a poor country, we're an emerging market country, so we can't expect first world kind of health infrastructure. But can we do more? Of course, we can do more. How much are we spending on health infrastructure as a percentage of GDP? Not enough. We can probably double that number. So basic, if our demographics is our huge strength, is our only resource that we can rely on forever, we have to take care of our demographics. How do you do that? It's education, it's healthcare, it's nutrition. Okay, we have to there's this old saying which I think that you should eat grass if you can create a nuclear bomb. This is what Bhutto said in Pakistan. I think we should eat grass if required, but just to make sure our youth have education, healthcare, and nutrition. Okay, why is this so important? Will this create jobs? Will education, healthcare, nutrition create jobs? It will, but it doesn't guarantee it, because guess what? The world is changing. COVID-19 is changing the world. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, technology, automation, everything is changing the world. Who the hell knows where jobs are 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now? I have no clue. Okay, but if you give our children healthcare, education, and nutrition, you're giving them the best bet to tackle whatever challenges come their way. This is the only thing we can give them. We cannot give them anything else. Okay, so to me, a focus on these three pivotal areas on the medium-term basis is important. I hope and pray that all of us start to clamor for these things, so that any government, doesn't matter which government, is forced to take care of these three areas as key investment areas. So what would I think are the longer-term prescriptions for India? One is a cleansing of the financial services ecosystem. It's very, very tough, but it can be done and it should be done. We don't have a choice. Second, cleansing of sectors such as power, real estate, telecom, airline, and shipping. Again, extremely tough. We've been kicking the can down the road for several years on these things, but they have to be addressed. Third, making it easy for entrepreneurs and for global investors, whoever, to create jobs in this country and to create output in this country. At least make for India, if not make in India. And last and most important common denominator in my view, focus on education, healthcare, and on nutrition as the best investment for our future, so that all of these things come together. Now, I'll end by saying what I started off in the beginning, which is that it's easy for me to make all this, give this gyan sitting on a chair, and as a professor who doesn't have to do these things. I know this is boiling the ocean stuff. It's very, very tough, but I don't see a way out. This is the only, we spend a lot of time looking for magical solutions. All you have to do is print money, sab theek ho jayega. All you have to do is the government has to blow up the fist, create demand, sab theek ho jayega. Excel spreadsheets cannot solve your problems. You have to focus on real sector reform, financial sector reform, power, real estate sector reform, creation of jobs reform, healthcare education reform. These are real sector reforms. You cannot create them on an Excel spreadsheet. I spend time on an Excel spreadsheet, but that's useless. You have to go into this real sector eventually. And I'll end again by saying, for all these very, very tough reforms, which is a treatment that we have to undertake to improve our health and to make ourselves fit to run a marathon again, we need accurate health reports. If a health report comes out saying this is the problems in the economy, don't take it as a negative. Every problem is solvable. In fact, I would say the opposite. If a report is suppressed, or if a report is said, we are told, actually don't worry about it, sab theek hai, that is the height of irresponsibility. Because for a curable problem, you're not making the patient aware of what the problem is. You're not making sure there is urgency around the patient taking up that bitter medicine. And the more we do that, the more we make it worse for the patient going forward basis. So I'll stop there. Very quick summary. India's economy was weak to start with, even before COVID-19, and there are some core structural issues. COVID-19 will be a body blow for our already weak economy. But the problem sets that we have all have solutions. Okay, there are short-term solutions which are required. A lot of good work is already happening on that. Maybe some more work can happen around MSMEs, and I think more packages will come along as we go along. The bigger one is medium-term solutions, and it requires a radical set of new thinking. It's not business as usual. To clean up the financial sector, other sectors, create jobs, and to focus on education, healthcare is almost like a reset of our policy. It's a great opportunity for us to reset that policy, given that we're going through this particular crisis. Hopefully there will be consensus across everybody, all stakeholders, to do this kind of things. If we go through this, and if not this, maybe some other parts, but I'm pretty sure it's not status quo. If we go through those paths to create jobs and output in this country, India's future remains extremely bright. There is no reason for us to doubt that future. But it will not come and fall into our lap. We'll have to work hard for it. We'll have to boil the ocean for it. Get ready to boil the ocean. You are the youthful people who will do all this hard work for us. Get ready to do all this hard work and keep your spirits up, but be realistic as well. I'll stop there, Shripal, and thank you for listening to me very, very patiently.
Thanks, Anant, for one of the best sessions till date on Indian economy, because this is one of the topics which we didn't cover, and this was, one of the best sessions we had. There are a lot of discussions on the fiscal deficit, on the rural demand picking up, and I think there are a lot of things which we are going on takeaways. So I'll just, because we have a lot of Q&As there, and I'll just take up the questions straight away. And apart from them, Ujjwal, you can just monitor the ones who wants to ask. They can raise their hands and you can unmute them. I'll just take up a couple of questions, and then you can unmute the participants so that they can directly kind of ask Anand there. So Anand, the first question what we had is, now which stock should we pick up in the stock market?
Okay. If you notice in my entire Gyan session, I didn't talk about markets at all. And the reason I don't do that is because I'm not an expert. I won't even pretend to be an expert. I think economists like me should stop pretending that we know where the markets are headed. Just as the market should stop pretending it's a indicator of where economy is headed. The two are different. And the reason why it's different is very straightforward. Markets eventually depend on flows. So if there are more buyers than sellers, you will see markets going up. If there are less buyers and more sellers, the market will come down. Now, very quick couple of statistics. Till December 2019, and this is pre-COVID obviously, so till December 2019, for the last 6 or 7 years, if I remember the numbers correctly, Nifty grew by about 11% per annum, 11.5% per annum. Earnings growth was 4% per annum for Nifty. Okay, and then there are plenty of other statistics like this. So there's a huge wedge between state of the economy, earnings, and the performance of asset markets, and there are different reasons for it. The biggest reason I can see is the fact that as domestic savers, many of us have turned to the equity market. Even I have invested in the equity markets. Whatever little savings I have a chunk in the equity markets. And the reason for that is multifold. One is, the popularity of mutual funds and equities has grown dramatically over the last 5-6 years. And full marks to AMFI for doing a great campaign. Second, on a tax-adjusted basis, equity still offers, despite all this gyan about LTCG, equity offers one of the best returns, especially when interest rates are falling the way they are, and whatever I earn on fixed deposits is anyway taxed fully at my marginal tax rate. So purely from a shifting of savings from traditional areas to equities, there is a dramatic improvement in equity markets. That's flow-based. SIP is at 8,000 crores plus, and that's not come down dramatically. It's only down by about 6% from March to April. SIP is over 8,000 crores per month, is telling you how much flows are going in. Therefore, it becomes a very flow story. And by the way, in all of this, here is another shocking statistic. The last 6 years, average FPI, or maybe last 5 years, average FPI in equity has been less than $2 billion per year. So it's not even foreign money which is holding up equity markets. It's domestic savings, you and me putting money in SIPs, which is actually holding up equity markets. So I'm not going to pretend I know what's happening on equity markets. Very quickly on sectors, sectors like healthcare, sectors like even IT for that matter, seem relatively okay. Some sectors like aviation, tourism, discretionary spending, etc., look tough. I think sectors which are linked to the rural economy will hold up. So maybe FMCG, maybe two-wheelers, those kind of tractor sales is again coming up very well. So very broadly from a sectoral basis, I think rural economy linked sectors will do reasonably well. But please don't ask me for individual stock recommendations. I'm terrible at it. In fact, I will turn the question and ask you, what should I do with?
Yeah, we have 2 students who have raised their hands. Yeah, Sriram, please go ahead and talk.
Good afternoon. This is the one question I have ready regarding for space. That's for ISRO. They have an announcement for the finance ministry stating that they will be giving private players the usage of assets and facilities to the ISRO. So in both these cases, what I have a contradictory statement is that ISRO is a national security threat for our nation. So it cannot be given for an easy way. So when they are giving it to the private players, does not affect the national threat to our safety and securities, despite we having the latest tension between China and with Nepal. So all these measures will not affect our GDP growth instead of giving it to foreign players, or we can go with domestic players itself?
Things like ISRO, etc., the public-private partnership which is being announced, is that good or bad or whatever, right? Look, I'm reasonably sure the government will ensure that things like DRDO, things like use of space technology for missile development, etc., will remain. That part will definitely not get privatized. That will remain with the government. In fact, I would strongly urge that, or strongly suggest that we should pay good money to get good experts in those areas for the government as well. In fact, one thing that China did extremely well was actually get back some of the best talent from overseas at reasonably comfortable packages, so that there is not just patriotism and nationalism which brings them back, but also reasonable comfort which brings them back and encourages good people to become part of these ventures. In a funny way, actually having ISRO, if you even look at Tesla and what they're doing with NASA, etc., getting private sector participation in commercial usage of space technology might not be a bad thing at all. In fact, it will help improve the amount of technology available for government offices as well. So as a concept, bringing in private participation into high technology, I think is good. It makes high technology available even for government or defense purposes. And I'm sure the government will have enough safeguards, enough ways to ensure that specific defense-related development is not impacted by these things. So that's a very layman answer.
Surajit is unmuted itself, sir.
Should I just go to the chat's Q&A? Should I go? Will that help? Or that's okay. Please go to Surajit.
Yeah, Anand sir, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I had actually 3 questions. I had my Q&A questions also, so I'll just tell you that. So mainly you said about the complexities that we have for the tax structure presently for someone trying to start his or own entrepreneurship. So you already clarified that. But see, the society and the family generally do not support us for this risk taking with the current scenarios around. So how do you think that we should actually the Atmanirbhar concept, how should we as young people stay motivated to that? This is my first question. My second question is, you mentioned that there's a lot of things that is being printed, like the money are being printed from RBI and loans are taken by the government. But I read, I think so, maybe a couple of weeks back that the excise collection was all record high for the first quarter compared to the last couple of years. And the PM Care Fund utilization is also not being shared by the data are not being shared. So do you think that the spending of figures that has been reported by the government is transparent as of with the current scenario? And my third question is regarding the outsourcing industry. Do you think that would be impacted because service industry is something where like more 60% of the GDP is there, which is supporting the service industry. So, do you think that where outsourcing is a very pivotal role presently in India? So, how do you think that the outsourcing industry would be impacted?
Okay, thanks for your questions. Yeah, very quickly on the first part, cultural aspects about doing fresh businesses, etc. Look, these will change over time. Okay, unfortunately, we've had this stigma for many decades now that if you get into business, it's tough, it's dirty, you have to keep a lot of people happy. I mentioned this Manish Sabharwal website on TeamLease where he talks about all the thousands of labor laws and compliances that you have to come up with and make sure that every inspector who comes to your office is happy. So that I guess has impact our perception of what people who do businesses. That can change and that will change. Eventually, we do need entrepreneurs to create value. We do need entrepreneurs to create employment. Already things like formalization, digitization, etc. Are making it a lot more difficult to do funny business. Things are becoming cheap. And this is again, over the years, over the decades, it is becoming cleaner. There are still lots of aspects to be cleaned up, but I'm sure that will happen. If we start, for instance, take the example of IT industry. Seen as one of the cleaner industries in the ecosystem, right? You don't hear stories about them. At least in the beginning days, you heard very little stories about. So I think it's a matter of time. As ease of investments and ease of doing businesses is improved, the concept of or the reputation of a person who's doing business also I think will improve. I think it's a problem. The last part was around outsourcing. Absolutely, it's a major risk and it's a great question. Fact is that globalization as a concept is under attack at this point in time. Lots of countries, including areas in like Eastern Europe, European Union, North America, everybody is realizing that too dependent on places like China and Asia for their supply chains, and therefore, and plus there is this populism about protecting your own country and nationalism and all that, which is doing the rounds. So some amount of localization is inevitable. In fact, at this point in time, it makes no sense to actually root for globalization and say, oh, globalization is a good thing. You're better off trying to protect what you have. So in this middle of all this, will our outsourcing business be impacted? Some of it is showing up. So H-1B visas, for instance, being restricted by President Trump, obviously impacts businesses. But to be honest, the IT industry has been preparing for this for a long time. Actual hiring of locals has improved dramatically by IT companies, and the writing has been on the wall for a long time. So I don't think they'll be impacted directly. Some businesses which are critical will be localized, but at least for Indian and things like Indian generic pharma, I think they end up being benefiting from this, because as things become a lot more digital, as things become a lot more work from home, things like IT backbone and IT support and remote support will improve going forward. So hopefully there could be pockets of impact, but on the whole, we should be fine. Having said that, I will also hope that we also pivot from being call centers to being tech providers as well, which means actually creating value-added tech services besides just price support. It is happening, to be honest, but I would love to see that pace picking up a lot more, just as China is doing. China has this China 2025 vision where they want to become a tech center rather than just a manufacturing center. Your second question, I didn't quite understand. It was about spending and excise and stuff like that. It jumbled up revenues as well as spending, which I didn't quite understand. But you mentioned something like excise numbers have gone up dramatically. Actually, they've not. GST numbers are at 90% of what they were in June last year. But you have to be careful with that number because after the lockdown was announced, the government gave leeway on not paying GST on time. So even me, for instance, I didn't pay my GST in April and May. I paid my GST in June for the 3 months put together. So a lot of the numbers that you see in June could actually be for March, April, May. And to that extent, therefore, 1 month is not a meaningful number. You have to see the cumulative across the 3 months. Cumulative across the 3 months is still a bad number. It's not a good number at all. So its economic activity is not there. So it's not really reliable. Spending has definitely gone up. Government spending, as I mentioned, NREGA, healthcare, and they're also releasing payments to MSMEs, etc. I think that spending is definitely going up. Ujjwal, should I take the next question?
Yes, sir. There is another student, Ali. Ali, if you are able to hear me, please go ahead with your question.
Hello, sir. Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Yeah. Yes, sir. My question is, as India banned some China apps and also government is rolling back the contracts given to Chinese companies, and also it is being followed by some countries, nations such as USA. This would definitely serve as a big opportunity for India, especially manufacturing MSME sectors. How should government capitalize this? And as also MSMEs had problem in getting funding for capital, how government should tackle these issues?
Great. It's not just government, it's all of us. You're right about this being an opportunity, but we have to recognize this opportunity will take time to actually fructify. It will not happen overnight. In fact, there's a very good article by Ratin Roy in Business Standard about this China trade issues. I would strongly urge all students to go through it. The point is that you cannot switch off supply chains overnight. So in our pharma industry, which is a big part of our exports as well, a lot of the APIs, the intermediate products actually come from China. Okay, so if you shut off that and you ask people to stop importing from China overnight, you actually create problems for yourself. But you're absolutely right. Over the medium term, gives us a huge set of opportunities to refocus on, as I mentioned, supply chains coming to India, at least for Make for India. And likewise on things like IT, etc., reducing the dependence on China, I think is a huge opportunity. What should happen? It's exactly what I told you guys, which is make ease of investments a lot better, whether it's land laws, labor laws, legal processes, policy certainty, capital raise, etc., etc. Second is the health of the financial system, so that it can actually facilitate growth and investments in the country. And third is those sectoral issues like power, real estate, etc., which is holding back the financial sector at this point in time. So it's not a small list; it's a very, very large list. It's going to be extremely tough to do all of this in one shot, but I think it's going to be important to. There's very little other choice. It's almost like people. I have done this as well. Compared with 1991, the first set of reforms. In many ways, and Dr. Subbarao in one of the webinars which SPJMR arranged, he mentioned this. In many ways, 1991 reforms were first-generation reforms and probably easier in some ways. What we're asking for, land, labor, capital reforms, and ease of doing investments reform, and financial sector reforms, these are far tougher. But good opportunity for us to focus our attention on doing all the stuff. And therefore create manufacturing and move our supply chains out of China and the rest of Asia. Great opportunity for us. Will require a lot of hard work.
So we'll be taking Q&A questions, sir. Like the previous question which Sriram has asked on railways is if railways offer to private players 5% down the line, concessions availed by senior citizens, railways, defense staff, and disabled people forego concessions at this juncture. So this won't push forward the GDP growth. It will be monopolistic. As for instance, currently IRCTC implements dynamic pricing or Tatkal pricing. If private players fix prices, think about the fares. At the end of the day, is government achieving the objective growth?
No, it's a great question. It's a very philosophical and ideological question as well. So it cannot be answered in a short time frame. But I'll tell you my quick two views on this. So let's take the generic situation about if there is a service or a good which, let's say, my aged mother who's 80 plus, she requires it and she can't afford it. Is it right for her to pay market price? I think that's a broad question you're asking, right? It's a deep question. So should the government provide these things for free? Should it be done by government-run agencies and so on and so forth? The problem with a government-run agency doing this as a monopoly is while the end price to the customer, my mother, is very good, the efficiency becomes questionable. And if you look at the economic health of public sector enterprises, it's in a terrible shape, barring some very good exceptions. And the notable exceptions are Navratnas, etc. But by and large, it's in very bad shape. Costs are run up quite dramatically because there's no market control on what the costs ought to be. And it all ends up becoming a burden to the government in some form or shape or the other. Some subsidy has to be paid or some fiscal deficit has to be taken on. If you want efficient delivery of services, it's better to open it up to competition. I completely agree with you. It can't be a monopoly. It can't be, a Tata, Birla, Ambani running railways alone. That doesn't work. It has to be a competition where there is people are vying with each other, and therefore the market kind of finds the right supply and demand. Now, you're right. If it is produced at market rates, rates will be very high. Now, if you have to give relief to people, do it directly from the government by way of direct benefit transfers. If you notice what the government is doing with LPG, for instance, it's not bringing down market price. It's giving a market price. And to the people who can't afford a cylinder at market price, then you're giving a direct benefit transfer to your account. That is a lot more transparent and ensures two levels of transparency. One, the market price is visible to all, and hopefully competition can come in and make the price as efficient as possible. Two, whatever is the subsidy you're giving to whoever is a deserving person is recognized and comes to the government as part of its open fiscal deficit. So these two things I think are important. If we can achieve these two, you have the best way of actually ensuring a fair, a humane marketplace, at the same time an efficient marketplace. But it's an ideological question. We can debate this over a coffee for several hours, actually, to be honest. But thank you for the question. Really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. So, sir, there's another question from Mobin Sheikh. Since 2017 post-demon, government has infused so much liquidity into banks using different measures like bank recapitalization. Don't know the status of it though. LTRO, reducing repo rate, CRR, SLR, etc. to help corporates borrow money, and also reducing corporate taxes, which is supply side of the economy, which I appreciate. But I'm failing to understand why government is ignoring the demand side of the economy, which is the consumption side. Till the time spending, consumption, buying doesn't increase, which can happen only when people have money and spending power. I don't see these things improving. Perhaps you may throw some light on this.
A great question, Mubin, and thank you so much, and good to hear from you. Look, I have a slightly different view on this demand versus supply question. So the demand side argument is put money in the hands of people. That will create demand and consumption, and that will automatically create the output. I think the risk in India is, given all the structural issues I mentioned for banking, for sectors, for creating jobs, if you put money in the hands of the people, one of two things can happen. One, if you give money to me, I will save it. I will not do anything. I will not spend it. If you give money to people who will spend it, they might end up buying stuff which we don't produce. And we saw that during 2009, 2013. Very different circumstances, but nevertheless. So we ended up buying gold, which we don't produce, so therefore we import from outside. We ended up buying energy, of course, which is outside of our control. And we ended up starting to buy electronics. Ended up starting to buy chemicals. We ended up buying fertilizers. We ended up buying plastics, a whole bunch of things, right? Which we were not manufacturing in-house. So the reason I kept mentioning jobs and output, this Keynesian thought of give people money to dig holes and fill them up, and that will start a virtuous cycle of consumption and output, I think is a dangerous one in India. Output is not automatic in India until you solve for the supply side issues which are stopping output from being formed. Okay, so I think both have to go together. Okay, you have to have jobs which give people money and therefore they're able to spend, and you should be producing that output within the country. If you're buying it from outside and you're importing it from outside, you are getting into a disaster. You're printing money which will just weaken the currency and create inflation. Both are important. So when I talked about Excel spreadsheet solutions of fiscal deficit ko blow up kar do sab theek ho jayega, I think that is nonsense. You blow up the fiscal deficit, you give everybody 10,000 rupees and ask them to spend. I can tell you at least 2,000 rupees out of that money will go overseas as part of imports. And that will create chaos for us. So I need both. I think we have to put money in the hands of people and ensure domestic output matches up to the amount of money you're giving to people. It is both. It's not one. Real economy problems have to be solved as well. Personal view, we can debate.
Yes, sir. So we have another question here from Anil Yadav. What are your thoughts on agriculture economy for sustainable contribution to Indian GDP, creating jobs?
Great. Thanks for that question, Chief. By the way, it's the single biggest provider of jobs already. And I hope and pray it doesn't create more jobs. We don't need agriculture to create more jobs. We need manufacturing and services to create more jobs. But you're right. The efficiency measures of output in India are far weaker compared to other countries. So China produces twice the amount of paddy that we do per hectare, and so on and so forth. There are lots of statistics around this, and lots of reasons behind it as well. Holdings have come down to really small holdings, over the generations as land parcels get split up, and there's simply no economies of scale. But as I mentioned during my talk as well, undertaking large-scale agricultural reform sounds great, and I'm sure it will happen. In fact, by the way, the marketing reforms which are happening right now, I didn't mention it, the PMC and all that is fantastic. It's much required. But if you make it more productive, which means actually means you have to bring down the number of people who are employed in agriculture, what do you do with all those people? So to me, the starting point is not making agriculture more productive. It is creating jobs outside of agriculture. No, very few people are in agriculture because they love agriculture. Okay, young generation particularly wants to get out of agriculture, and you can't blame them, right? Point is, are there enough opportunities for getting out of agriculture? People now, a lot of people, because monsoons are good, migrant labor which has gone back to the villages are doing agriculture, right? But that's largely because there's no other option. Now, therefore, I think the bigger question is, are we creating enough productive jobs to draw away people from agriculture? And once that happens, automatically the steps needed to make agriculture more efficient will come through. And I don't want to repeat the statistics, and they're not comparable. US, the population which I think is engaged in agriculture is some ridiculously low number, 2 or 3% or something. Some very, very tiny number. And US is the breadbasket of the world. It produces the most amount of corn for the whole world. So we can make agriculture far more productive. We can increase land sizes, we can do cooperatives, we can mechanize more, we can reduce the amount of labor involved. But first, we have to create jobs elsewhere and draw out people from agriculture, then go in for productivity improvement.
Yes, sir. So there's one interesting question. Do you think that big corporates will go for business expansion and demand credit from banks? No corporate want to expand at this point of time when demand slowdown is expected.
It's a great question. It's a lovely question. And you're right. Even before COVID-19, as of December, so RBI comes out with this, it's called the OPICUS survey. But in that, there's something called the CU is capacity utilization. So they come out with the capacity utilization number. As of December, if I remember the number right, it was about 68 something percent or 69%. That's the lowest number in the series that I remember seeing. Okay, so which means that capacity utilization is extremely low, signifying the fact that the economy was slowing down dramatically, right? Now, if capacity utilization is so low, how the hell are you going to create fresh capacity? Why would you create fresh investment? So it's a great challenge, to say that we need supply side measures, but who the hell is going to invest, right? And it is a problem, and there is a chicken and egg story involved here. In a sense, I talked about how money is going to the rural folk, and there is a silver lining in the economy as far as the rural economy is concerned. Agriculture looks like it's going to do very well this year. I can still hear the rains outside my window. Hopefully, things will come out as a great crop. So hopefully that will give rise to some demand. But you're right, more demand stimulus might be required at some stage. Alongside though, we've got to make sure that that output matches that demand creation which happens. Once we see a bit of a restart of the economy, where things get back to at least pre-COVID levels, and there is visibility about the future. As I mentioned, we need a game plan about how we're going to create jobs over the next 10 years, 15 years. If we have a credible game plan, two things will happen. One, a lot of global investors will start putting money in India, despite localization, despite everybody withdrawing to their own country. Now, I speak to global investors. I'm also an analyst for what's called the Observatory Group. In that capacity, I speak to global investors. There is so much of goodwill towards India. It's just incredible. So when I give a story and say, not looking great in India right now in the short term, they look at me and say, that's okay. Long term is all fine for India. They have so much of faith in India. So if we can give them some visibility of how we are making things easier to invest in India, I'm pretty sure global investors will come in and start investing in India. The foreign direct investment will go up. It's already going up, by the way. And therefore, that will create jobs. So the first impetus towards investments might not be from our own large corporates. It might be from FDI, maybe Foxconn, maybe Apple, maybe Boeing, maybe some people will start putting in money in India, at least for Make in India. Once that happens, and some amount of lubrication of the economy is going through, jobs being created and therefore demand being created and capacity utilization goes up, then you will see private sector coming in as well. Okay. And by the way, private sector does not need to see capacity utilization go back to 80% for them to start investing. They might start investing even before that if there is conviction that we are headed in the right way. So to me, having a game plan of how we will increase jobs and output and improve ease of doing investment is number one. Once that is in place, a lot of other things will follow.
So there is another question which says, where shall I invest my money? Is it bonds, FD, gold, equity market, or property?
So when you find the answer to that question, please let me know as well. I would be very interested. But you are students, so you would be reading those papers. A lot of research has gone through into this question, by the way. It's a very good question on something called asset allocation. So there is, I think, this paper by Benson, Bauer, I forget the names, but three research analysts, B. Bauer, I think, three people who put together a question on asset allocation. Very good paper, which essentially says that for most people, if you're trying to take care of your savings and your wealth, etc., the biggest question you have to spend time over is asset allocation. It's not about choosing individual stocks. It's not about timing the market. कि आज नीचे लग रहा है, आज खरीदता हूँ, कल ऊपर लगेगा, ऊपर है तो मैं बेच लूँगा. It's more about deciding your asset allocation. Now, it's a very individual exercise. There is no one size fits all answer possible. You have to be aware of what your risk appetite is, and accordingly you have to choose different asset classes. Few things which, in fact, yesterday we had a speaker at our SPJIMR Institute who gave us a lot of insights about investments. I can't take his name because it was a Chatham House kind of a session. But he did mention things like the need for diversification for most people. I mean, not everybody, but for most people. So equal or appropriate amounts in equity, real estate, commodities, gold, all of it, debt, fixed income. The second is need to avoid bad years, which is that, if you put too much of eggs into one basket, you risk having a very, very large bad year. So be aware of that. And the third is, of course, the power of compounding, which is be aware that if you stick along with an asset allocation for a long time, it gives you phenomenal returns over time. So I haven't answered your question, but do read up that paper, asset allocation. That has a lot of insights in it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'm sure they'll read it. Sir, then there's the next question, which I have two. Can Vodafone be revived? And some advice on some good books to read on economy.
Can Vodafone be revived? That's completely out of syllabus for me. Can it be revived? It can be revived. That's a simple answer. Will it be revived? I have no idea. It's way beyond my pay grade. I'm not the person deciding, and I'm not even influencing the person deciding, so I have no idea. How would it be revived? Look, it can be revived in one of multiple ways. One is, of course, that tariffs go up, and by the way, tariffs are going up slowly, and therefore things match up. Second, they get some relief on this AGR and spread it over time, maybe as one way out. As a sector, look at it from, rather than going into individual names, telecom clearly is a critical sector for us, right? And we are using phones and we're using the Zoom and all of that so regularly now. So the entire communication sector is obviously going to be extremely critical going forward. So I have no doubt that as a sector, it's a critical sector and it should be a profitable sector. There are some extraneous reasons causing issues there. At some stage, I'm sure they will get resolved. Individual names, I have no idea, but I'm sure the sector will do well. On books, why don't I send across a list separately to you, Ujjwal or Shripal, and I'll think through some names and send them across to you.
Yes, sir. Sir, so coming to the another question, do you think high lending rate is hindrance for growth of small businesses?
Of course it is. I mean, it's a straightforward question with a straightforward answer. The higher the cost of funds, your internal rate of return on your investments has to be that much higher for you to actually make money, right? So which means it's a hindrance. I think the deeper question is, why are rates high? Are they high, first of all? And second is, why are they high? And what can be done to bring them down? I think at least the risk-free rates have come down dramatically. So RBI has done a great job. They've brought down repo rate to 4%. In fact, the overnight repo rate in the market is even below 3% right now. So they brought down rates really sharply. They've also controlled the Government of India bond yields very well. So it's about 5.85% or so right now, 10-year bond yield. So they've controlled that extremely well. The problem is the credit spread, right? So for a small person to go and borrow, particularly if you don't have too many banks, the rates can be very, very high. So I talked about a part of this. One is the fact that there is a trust deficit. We've had so many cases of numbers not matching, governance issues, and so on and so forth, that people are naturally a little scared. That is getting addressed with a lot of the formalization which is happening right now. So things like GST payments, keeping a track of therefore what payments are coming in and out, and much more of transactions happening now on electronic medium rather than on cash basis. I think is bringing a lot of transparency, and databases are improving as well. So you have Krylik, you have a whole bunch of fintech which is now geared towards trying to provide reliable data about credit history, etc., to lenders. So I think that will slowly improve over time. The second is what I mentioned about the health of the financial sector. If it is sitting with so many NPAs, if it is burdened with so much of sins of the past, it has to recover that money somewhere, and therefore it naturally will have to have a high spread on its base lending to be able to survive. So as I said, cleaning up the financial sector should go a long way to bringing down the cost of funds as well. So two things. One is more transparency, more formalization, more credit history and reliable credit history, followed by a cleaning up of the financial sector should bring down lending rates, which goes back to the point about making capital more accessible to people who want to invest.
Yes, yes. So there are like many questions, but we'll take another two and we can see how we can answer the others. So another question is, what would be the impact of recent launched sovereign gold bonds?
Oh, great question. So there's about, I think about 15,000 crores now outstanding. I don't know the exact number. I think it's a good move by the government to ensure that our natural love for the gold, for the yellow metal, doesn't result in additional imports. what tends to happen is every time we fear inflation or every time we feel that rupee might weaken, we end up buying gold. So in fact, in fiscal year 2014, I think FY 12, 13, gold imports went up some ridiculous level. The net gold import was some $45 billion or something. So that was solely one of the big reasons why rupee started weakening in a dramatic way between 2011 and 2013. And why did that happen? Because inflation was very high and people were scared about protecting the value of their money. So what the government is doing is, if you're worried about gold, or rather if you're worried about inflation, you're trying to buy a natural hedge, I'll give you the economic benefit of holding on to gold without you holding on gold. So buy it from me instead. Now they've also sweetened up by offering interest, right? So 2.5% interest, whereas if I hold physical gold, I earn no interest. So in a way, it's a nice way of getting people to buy gold without actually buying gold. And the risk is run by the government, which after all can print money and pay back whatever you want. I mean, it's a rupee denominated bond, so they will convert it and give it to you. What is the big problem? So I think it's a good format. Hopefully, it will bring down our investment appetite for gold. It will not take away our jewelry appetite for gold. This investment appetite of gold will go into this particular form.
Yes, sir. So the question is from Anusha. So market situation after COVID-19, do we have any possibility to get financial assistance from MSME since all the tie-ups from China are no more?
So as we discussed in the chat, I am hopeful that at some stage, maybe in the next 1 month, 2 months, we will see another package for MSMEs. I'm guessing that maybe the government is waiting to get some more clarity around what the real status is, and which should be getting available now. At some stage, it will be inevitable, giving some more support to MSMEs. Now, on the broader point about if they want to set up stuff to replace Chinese imports, will there be more benefits? I think I'm definitely hoping that happens. Okay. So all the stuff I mentioned is non-monetary, right? So cleaning up the financial sector, cleaning up of other sectors, making it easier to invest. These are non-monetary, ways of promoting fresh investments, and therefore the MSME part as well. On the monetary side, I'm hoping that a recovery in the financial sector will bring down cost of funds anyway. I'm also hoping for more things like interest subvention, etc., to come through, which gives a benefit to MSMEs who are producing stuff, actual good output, and giving jobs. There are restrictions, so there are WTO rules and etc., which prevent too much of subsidizing of industry, particularly if it is towards exports. But I'm sure we can manage all of that and do something. So to answer your question, yes, both non-monetary and monetary incentives to the MSME, I think, will be forthcoming. I'm definitely hoping it's forthcoming, and will go a long way towards creating what I think is the final answer, which is jobs and output.
Yes, sir. So one final question, sir. What will be the impact of our economy if we completely ban Chinese products like Chinese apps?
So our total trade deficit with China and Hong Kong put together is over $50 billion. Okay. And that's why please read that article by Ratin Roy, Dr. Ratin Roy, in Business Standard. I think it came out yesterday or day before. It is some of it is consumption oriented. So telephones, for instance, right? It's you can argue whether it's productive or not. A lot of people say it's not productive. Some of it is discretionary things like toys and plastics, etc., which we can make at home ourselves. Okay. Some of it is essential. So, for instance, if you are, I talked about APIs for pharma, right? The raw ingredients which go into our pharmaceutical products. I'm told about 50% of it comes from China. Right? You can't stop that overnight. So unfortunately, that our dependence on Chinese imports has grown over time, over the years. It was very little in early 2000. Now it's like extremely large. It's our largest trading partner if you combine China and Hong Kong put together. You cannot switch it off as one switch. That would be a disaster for us. Okay. Can we live with it? Of course, we can live with it. I mean, we are living with COVID-19, which is completely out of syllabus as well. So if push comes to shove, we can do it. But would it be pleasant? Would it be good for the economy? Not really. It would have a lot of costs for us. The response to China has to be a lot more thoughtful. There is a military part. I'm not even talked about it, and I don't want to talk about it. I'm not an expert. Military part is totally different. Economic part requires a lot more thought out, and there is no doubt we have to respond economically, both for our own good and to take care of this, this border issue that we have with China. And the way to do it is to do it over time. As I said, if you create investments, jobs, and output in India, effectively you will be bringing supply chains onshore. It will not happen overnight. You cannot create, ICs in chips and other APIs for pharma, etc. Overnight. It doesn't happen overnight. You need a whole ecosystem for it. So over time, if you put the investments in place, if you create jobs and output, it will happen, and that's the best way to respond. But if you're doing it overnight with a switch off, "Aaj main band kar dunga," you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're not really hurting China as much as you're hurting yourself. You're cutting your nose to spite your face.
Yeah, Ujjwal, I'll be taking up. Anand, I have one more last question, though I think Ujjwal have taken up. So this question is from my side itself, because I haven't asked any question till now. So Anand, now because every leader, whenever they come here, we normally ask the routine and all. So I want to ask, what is Anand Narayan routine? When does he wake up? What does he do? What is his normal day routine, and how it goes? And when does he sleep? So this is something for our students to understand what is something different Anand is doing, or it's the daily routine, or it's the same routine, what we are following.
Anant is not such an important person that you have to track what my routine is. Believe me, you will not benefit anything from it. But since you asked, Shripal, here is what I would suggest. You have to find a rhythm which makes sense to you, right? If there is anything which I've learned through the COVID-19 crisis, working from home, etc., be open to ideas. But eventually, the person who has to decide what works and doesn't work is you. There is no one-size-fit-all routine or formula for efficiency or for success. It is entirely your DNA. The biggest takeaway, if you want, is in this respect, please talk to yourself. Please have self-talk. What do you want to do? What would make you happy? What is it that you're trying to do, short-term, medium-term? This only you know. And everybody is different. Everybody's formula will be different. And once you know that, by the way, there is so much of clutter that we get, including from social media, including from speaking to friends, etc., that we often don't speak to ourselves. Please speak to yourself. Figure out what you want to do. Once you have that, you will figure out what is the best routine that works for you. There are people who follow crazy routines, each diametrically opposite from each other. There's nothing right or wrong. Whatever makes you happy, whatever gives you the sense of you doing something efficient, that works well. Personally, in my own case, I do try and follow a routine. I do wake up early. I find my most productive time for doing creative thinking, which is if you want to mull over a problem, which is a research question or looking for insights, etc. The best, most productive time I find is in really early morning. And by that, I mean 5:30 to 7:30. So that kind of works for me. And my creativity, whatever little of it is there, mostly comes from those particular times. I do try and ensure there is a morning session and an afternoon session, which kind of is demarcated. So make sure that even if you're not going to for work or to the institute, at least from 9 o'clock onwards, you're sitting in one place which looks like an office, and this is my workspace, and at least repeat the work of a 9 to 5 with a lunch break in between. And thereafter, after 5 o'clock, keep yourself completely free. In fact, one thing which works for me is you should have a period in the day when you're bored. There's research to suggest that your most creative period where you're thinking a lot is when you're bored. So ensure half an hour of boredom as well, which means you don't have any telephone or no social media, nothing. You're just sitting and thinking. That's pretty useful as well. And the last part of the day is entirely for family and for health. And I try and make it to the gym every day. I try and take a walk. I try and spend time with my kids who are here with me at home. We watch Netflix and TV together. So evening part is entirely open for family. That's my routine. As I said, it's nothing earth-shattering. But the broader question is, don't try and copy-paste somebody else's routine. Find out what you want, what works for you. And that self-talk, I think, is the most critical thing you can do for yourself.
Thank you so much, Anant. I think that was one of the good piece of advice. Like most of the students who are there. So follow your own routine and understand what's your comfort zone and design the plan according to that. And I'm really sorry that we spoke about 1.5 hour session and it went up to 2 hours and we still have the attendees attending it. So I think if you keep talking, there'll be like a full day, they would be there and they would be kind of listening you. So that kind of sums up the session, how beautiful it was. And thank you so much, Anand, for taking out this precious time and sharing the knowledge with us. Thank you so much. Ujjwal, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Shripal. Really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much once again for taking out your time from the busy schedule for everyone. And we hope to see many students participate in other sessions also. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Ujjwal. Thank you very much. And God bless and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.